Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really interesting challenge in ecology, how to create some order around the study of species moving across the globe.
Yeah, it's a big one. Anyone who's tried to compare, say, research on invasive mussels in a lake with invasive plants on land knows the headache.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You see terms like established or introduced, but they often mean slightly different things depending on who you're reading. Gets confusing fast.
And that confusion, that lack of a shared vocabulary, has really held back the field of invasion biology. So today we're diving into a key paper aiming to sort this out.
Right. It's titled A Proposed Unified Framework for Biological Invasions, led by Tim Blackburn and a whole team of co-authors. A major piece of work.
It really is. Our goal here is to walk you through this framework, why it was needed, how it pulls together these, sometimes conflicting ideas, and why having this common language is so vital.
Basically, consider this your guide to how invasion scientists are now trying to classify and understand invasive species, all on the same page. Okay, so let's start with the why. Why was this paper even necessary? What was the problem they were trying to solve?
Well, the source material highlights this explosion of research on biological invasions over the last, say, 20 years, which is great, obviously.
More data, more insights.
Right, but the downside was that different groups of researchers kind of went off into their own corners. You had people studying land animals, freshwater fish, marine invertebrates, forest plants.
And they weren't always talking to each other or using the same concept?
Precisely. You got these silos. Terrestrial folks might not read the marine literature and vice versa. They were all studying invasion, but with different rule books.
It sounds like a recipe for reinventing the wheel or just talking past each other.
That's exactly what was happening. It hampered progress. And the biggest split, the major conceptual divide, was really between plant ecologists and most animal ecologists.
Okay, how so? What were the two different approaches?
Well, plant ecologists, often dealing with things like seeds needing the right soil or light, they gravitated towards something called the Richardson framework. This one really focuses on the barriers a species has to overcome.
Barriers like surviving the local climate or finding a way to reproduce.
Exactly. Physical or biological obstacles. Can this individual plant overcome this specific hurdle? Now, on the other side, you had most animal ecologists.
Dealing with things that move around more, maybe establish big populations.
Right. They tended to use frameworks based on earlier work by Williamson, and these focus more on the sequential stages of invasion.
Stages like being transported, then establishing, then spreading out.
Exactly. It's more about the status the species achieves along that pathway. Is it just here, or is it actually self-sustaining? Is it spreading widely? It's focused on the outcome, the population level.
So Richardson is more about the obstacles an individual faces, and Williamson is more about the outcome or status achieved by the population.
You've got it. One is obstacle-focused, kind of implicitly individual-based. The other is outcome-focused, implicitly population-based. Looking at the same journey, but, highlighting different landmarks.
It seems like they should be compatible, though. You have to overcome barriers to reach the next stage, surely.
That was the key insight. The Blackburn team realized this difference was mainly about focus, not fundamental disagreement. Every stage in the Williamson model is reached by overcoming a barrier described by Richardson.
Ah, so they weren't really competing ideas, just different perspectives on the same underlying process.
Exactly, complementary views. And that realization opened the door to merging them into one unified approach.
Okay, but merging them probably wasn't straightforward. You mentioned they used terms differently. Were there specific points they had to sort of reconcile?
Oh, definitely. A couple of sticky points needed clarification. One was right at the beginning, the introduction stage.
What was the issue there?
Well, historically, the animal-focused models often thought of introduction as like someone deliberately releasing a pet snake or animals escaping from a zoo, a specific event of liberation.
Okay.
The plant models were often more about, say, a garden plant spreading over the fence, more tied to the environment and cultivation.
Seem quite different.
They do, but when you look closer, the distinction blurs. Lots of plants are contained, think of crops in a field, or ornamental plants behind a hedge. That's a form of captivity.
Like the snake in its cage.
Exactly. And conversely, think about marine species. Huge numbers of animals get transported accidentally in ship ballast water and just released directly into the environment. No deliberate liberation, no initial captivity.
So the idea of containment, or lack thereof, actually applies across the board to both plants and animals, whether it's intentional or accidental release.
Precisely. That helped bridge that gap. The other big area for clarification was around establishment.
Getting properly set up in the new place.
Yeah, and specifically how factors like the sheer number of individuals introduced affect success. This concept called propagule pressure.
Okay, propagule pressure.
Mm.
That term comes up a lot. Can we just quickly nail that down? Is it just about how many arrive?
It's mostly about quantity, yeah.
Yeah.
How many individuals are introduced, but also how often introductions happen, and maybe even the health or quality of those individuals. Basically, the overall introduction effort.
And why was that tricky for the frameworks?
Well, the Williamson stage model recognized that higher propagule pressure really boosted the chances of a population establishing. Makes sense, right? More starting individuals, better odds.
Sure. Safety in numbers.
But the Richardson barrier model, which focused purely on environmental or reproductive hurdles, didn't really have a neat place for it. Propagule pressure isn't really an environmental barrier itself, but it massively affects whether a species overcomes those environmental or survival barriers.
I see. So you needed a model that could account for both the specific obstacles and these broader factors like the size of the invading force.
Exactly. Both the outcome focus, like establishment success driven by numbers, and the obstacle focus, like surviving a harsh winter, needed to be integrated.
And that integration led them to the big reveal.
Yes. The unified framework for biological invasions. This is the core of the paper. It's designed to apply to absolutely all human-mediated invasions, any species, any environment.
So what does it look like? How is it structured?
It lays out 4 clear sequential stages: transport, introduction, establishment, and spread. Pretty logical progression.
Okay.
But the crucial part is that it explicitly shows these stages are separated by specific barriers. You have geography, then captivity or cultivation, then survival, reproduction, dispersal, and finally environment.
So it weaves the stages and barriers together directly. It's not just a list of stages anymore. It's a map showing the hurdles between them.
Exactly. The visual diagram makes that connection really clear.
Now, the paper argues this unified framework offers several specific advances. I think they list 9 key points. Let's unpack some of the most important ones. What's really new or clarified here?
Well, that explicit integration of barriers between stages is the first big one, just formalizing that connection. But the real novelty comes in how they defined and used those barriers.
Okay, like that captivity or cultivation barrier you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Why make that specific human-imposed barrier so prominent?
Because it highlights a critical management point before a species even gets loose in the wild. It acknowledges that often we prevent invasions simply by keeping things contained a fence around a pasture, quarantine regulations for imports.
So it defines that sort of preemptive prevention stage.
Precisely. It's crucial for managing intentional imports. But they also included that skip arrow B3, I think they label it.
Right, for the things like organisms in ballast water or accidental seed contaminants that bypass containment altogether.
Exactly. That arrow acknowledges the huge number of accidental introductions that go straight into the environment. So the model covers both pathways, intentional containment and accidental release. It's flexible.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the third point? They replaced Richardson's environmental barrier early on with a survival barrier specifically within the establishment stage. Why that change? It seems subtle.
It's more than just wording. It's about acknowledging chance and complexity. The old way kind of implied failure to establish was just because the environment wasn't right, too cold, too dry, whatever.
But it's not always that simple.
No. The new survival barrier makes it clear that failure at this early stage can happen for lots of reasons interacting together. Yes, environment matters, but so do the species' own traits, maybe the specific microlocation it landed in, or sheer bad luck, like that propagule pressure point. Maybe only a few individuals arrived and they just couldn't find each other or got eaten by random predators, even if the climate was okay.
So it separates not surviving initially from hitting the ultimate environmental limits later on.
Exactly. It allows for that stochastic, random failure of small populations, and that ties directly into their fourth advance, really emphasizing that establishment is fundamentally a population process.
Not just about 1 or 2 individuals managing to reproduce once.
Right. It requires a population to be self-sustaining over time. They get technical and say the long-term population growth rate, the geometric mean, has to be greater than 0.
Meaning it's growing or stable,
Yeah.
not shrinking towards zero over the long haul.
Correct. It needs to get through multiple generations, weathering the ups and downs of seasons and random events, to be truly considered established. It's a higher bar than just initial survival and reproduction.
Okay. Then, once a species is established and starts to spread, they bring back an environmental barrier, but this time it's linked to spread. Why reintroduce it there?
Because the challenge changes scope. The initial survival barrier was about succeeding right at the introduction point. Now, as the population expands outwards, it starts encountering a much wider range of conditions, different soils, temperatures, competitors, predators, maybe different altitudes.
Ah, so it's testing the species limits across a landscape.
Exactly. It's like facing a whole series of mini establishment challenges as it pushes into new areas. This environmental barrier during the spread stage represents the ultimate limits to how far the species can actually go, the maximum potential range set by the environment.
Got it. Now, the sixth advance is really interesting. They deliberately exclude impact from the framework itself. Why separate the process of invasion from whether the species causes harm? Seems counterintuitive to some.
It's absolutely crucial for clarity, both scientifically and for management. By defining invasion only by the biological process, does it get transported, does it establish, does it spread, they keep the science neutral.
So whether it's a pest or causes economic damage is a separate question.
Completely separate. You could have a species that successfully reaches the final stage, category E, fully invasive, but causes no noticeable harm. Conversely, you might have something that only briefly establishes, but causes massive temporary economic damage.
So classifying it scientifically doesn't automatically label it as bad.
Exactly. It keeps the biological assessment clean. Policymakers or managers can then take that neutral biological classification and overlay the economic, social, or environmental impact assessments to decide on action. It prevents the science from getting tangled up in value judgments.
That makes a lot of sense. And the last key point you mentioned was acknowledging that failure can happen at any stage, even after spreading.
Yes, this recognizes the reality of population dynamics. Invasion isn't always a one-way street. We see boom and bust cycles. A species might spread widely, reach that final spread stage, but then maybe it depletes its main food source, or a disease sweeps through, or it just can't cope long-term.
And the population crashes or even disappears locally.
Exactly. So the framework explicitly allows for failure even after reaching advanced stages. It captures that dynamic reality.
Okay, so we have this unified map, stages linked by explicit barriers covering all species and systems. How does this translate into, practical benefits for managers trying to actually do something about invasions?
Well, that's the eighth advance, management integration. Because the framework lays out these distinct stages and the barriers between them, it becomes much clearer where different management actions fit.
For example,
While prevention efforts like quarantine or treating ballast water clearly target the very early stages, transport and overcoming that captivity cultivation barrier. Eradication efforts make most sense early in the establishment stage when populations are small and localized.
and things like containment or slowing the spread.
They map directly onto the spread stage, trying to reinforce that final environmental barrier or limit dispersal. The framework gives managers precise targets for their interventions. It tells you what you're trying to stop at each point.
And tied to that is the ninth point, terminology standardization, just getting everyone on the same page with the words they use.
Hugely important. Now, if someone says a species is naturalized or established, there's a clear definition linked to specific stages and barriers in the unified framework. It doesn't matter if you study weeds or worms. The terms mean the same thing biologically. That smooths the path from research findings to effective management action.
And to make this even more practical, they developed a categorization scheme, didn't they? Like labels for populations.
Yes. Table 1 in the paper. It's a standardized A to E scheme. It lets you classify a specific population based on how far the most advanced individuals have gotten along that invasion pathway. A being still in the native range, up to E being fully invasive and spreading.
And they use some great examples to show how this works in practice and how complex it can be. The budgerigar, the pet parakeet, was a good one.
Yeah, fascinating example. In most of the UK, budgies that escape are category C0. They get past the captivity barrier, escaping their cage, but they fail the survival barrier pretty quickly. They just don't last long in the wild. But then you look at the Isles of Scilly, off the coast of Cornwall. There, a small population actually reached C2. They survived and reproduced for a while. That's establishment.
So they overcame the survival and reproduction barriers there?
Kind of. The catch was they only managed it because people were feeding them. They needed that extra support. Without it, they likely would have failed. So C2 signifies establishment, but with dependence. It's a very specific category.
And then there was the Florida example, showing the boom and bust.
Right. Budgies in Florida actually established and started spreading, reaching category D2, but then the population crashed and failed. That shows that even reaching an advanced stage isn't necessarily permanent. Failure is always possible.
So you can have different populations of the same species in different categories in different places or at different times.
Absolutely. Contrast the budgie with something like black wattle, Acacia mearnsii in South Africa. That's a classic category E. It got there, established, spread widely, reproduces successfully on its own across vast areas. It ticked all the boxes.
And having these categories helps managers prioritize, presumably. Focus on preventing CDs from establishing versus containing S.
Exactly. It clarifies the status and helps target resources effectively. They also gave examples of biological control agents that failed at specific barriers, showing how the framework applies even when we intend for a species to establish, but it doesn't.
So, stepping back, this unified framework really feels like a landmark achievement. It provides that common language and conceptual map that was sorely needed.
It really does. It integrates decades of research from all corners of invasion biology, plants, animals, marine, freshwater, terrestrial, into one cohesive picture of the invasion process.
And by clarifying that process, those stages and barriers, it seems like it directly empowers more effective action. We understand how it happens, so we can better figure out where and when to intervene.
That's the goal. Moving from fragmented understanding to coordinated research and ultimately more successful management strategies based on a shared, clear model of the invasion pathway.
So the framework is out there, being adopted. What's the next big step? What key questions does this framework tee up for future research?
Well, the framework itself is a foundation meant to be built upon. One critical thing it highlights is the need to be really specific about time and place. As we saw with the budgie, a species isn't just invasive. It's invasive or establishing or failing at a specific location and at a specific time.
So more spatially and temporally explicit studies are needed.
Definitely. But perhaps the biggest challenge now is moving from describing the stages and barriers to actually predicting which species are likely to breach which barriers under what conditions. Now that we have the map agreed upon, the real work is figuring out the mechanisms, the traits, the environmental factors, the interactions that determine success or failure at each critical step.
Understanding why some species cross those lines and others don't.
Exactly. That predictive power is the next frontier, and this unified framework gives us the solid conceptual grounding we need to pursue it.